So in this video, we're going to talk about yet another modifier. And in this case, I want to talk about the Displace Modifier. Now this one is a little harder to use than the Mirror Modifier and the Array Modifier, but is really useful if you're trying to create a little bit of noise or variation in your model. And it's something that gets used all the time in low poly model, in particular when you're doing landscapes or maybe something organic like the leaves on a tree. It's going to add a little bit of randomness to our object and make it a little less uniform. And it's going to do it in a quick, fast way, just like other modifiers and non-destructive, that is going to save us time. So what you can see here is I have a plane that has been subdivided several times. And maybe this is a terrain that I want to create, and I just want to give it a little bit of variation so it's not totally flat. So I'm going to come back into object mode, go to my modifier tab. I'm going to go to the Displace Modifier, which is over here under the deform column. I'm going to add that. And you'll notice what happens is I've scooted up. And that has to do with some of the mathematics that's going on. Right now, it's displaced it to the maximum amount. And now this will be a little confusing if you're not used to this idea. We're going to use a texture to help displace this model. And the reason that works is our texture is going to be black and white. Black has a value of 0, white has a value of 1, and then the shades of gray in between have decimal values. Those values tell Blender how much to displace this model. And right now, we're displacing it all the way to the top. So here in the Displace Modifier, this first place here is where the texture is going to go. So I'm going to create a new texture by hitting the plus. You can see now we went back down. Right now, the texture is black, so we're not displacing this at all. Now to access the texture, it's not the only way to do it, but it's a pretty easy way to do it. We're going to come over here and push, I don't know what you'd call these little jelly bean buttons. And we're going to go to the texture. And here, again, you can see the preview. The texture's completely black, which is why we're not displaced at all. You can come in here and there's a bunch of different ones that are in here. I typically like the clouds. You can play around with different textures and see the different results. When I do that, you can see that the preview is all kind of noisy, looks a little bit like clouds, and my model matches that. So we're going to leave this texture as is. There are some settings down below that you can play around with it, but I'm going to come back to the modifier tab. Now here, what I want to use is this strength slider. And I'm going to slide this down. It can go negative, it can go positive, it can even go bigger than 1. But usually a value of something like 0.2, maybe 0.15 is pretty good. And what you can see is that this plane that might be a landscape or just some terrain now has some variety and texture to it. It's a whole lot more interesting to look at. One thing to note is that this strength is relative to the scale of the object. If I scale this up, you get bigger displacements. If I scale it down, you get smaller displacements. So just keep in mind that that strength value is relative to what you're working on, and you don't always want the exact same value. Now, one thing to note about the Displace Modifier and other modifiers, but it depends modifier to modifier. If I go into edit mode, that modifier is no longer shown. And those options, the view options, are up here at the top. So this button here, the second one, is toggled off, and that's just show this modifier in edit mode. So if I click on that, you can see the results of the modifier in edit mode. Notice that my edges and my vertices do not follow that. So this just gives you an idea of what it's going to look like. There's other options here. You can toggle off whether this gets shown in the viewport at all. You can toggle it off so it's not shown in the viewport. This last one is toggling off whether it's shown in a render. So if you're going to render this out to a 2D image, is this modifier going to get shown or not? Another use case, as I mentioned at the beginning of the Displace Modifier, is something organic, maybe some leaves on a low poly tree. And again, we can add that modifier like so, and you get a little bit more organic of a shape, a little less regular shape. Again, you can play with your strength and get different shapes. It gets a little weird, it gets a little wacky. So it's a great way to take something like an icosphere, make it a little less regular, a little more organic looking, and we do it quickly and easily. There's one last option on the Displace Modifier that I want to talk about, and that has to do with this coordinate settings here. If I move this object around, you can see it just kind of moves around as usual. It also means that if I duplicate it and slide it over, it's exactly the same, which is often not what I want. If I'm making leaves or maybe I'm making rocks for my scene, I might want to move them around and have each rock be a little bit different. And I can do that by changing the coordinates. If I change these to global, you can now see that it's changed, it's different than the other rock. If I duplicate this rock and slide it over, you can see every time I move it, it changes a little bit. And that's because it's using its global position with that texture to displace itself. Now, this can be useful or not so useful. I often find for organic shapes, using the global coordinates is really helpful in creating that extra variety in my scene.